You think you know what horror feels like. A cold shiver in the dark, a sudden noise at midnight, the uneasy awareness that something isn't quite right. But the truth, real horror isn't a jump scare. It's a slow, steady hand gripping the back of your neck, pulling you closer to something you can't unsee. Tonight, you're stepping into a gallery of nightmares, each frame dedicated to a killer who will make you rethink every locked door and late-night walk home. 10 faces, 10 stories, and every one of them more disturbing than you can imagine. You've already taken the first step, and there's no turning back now. You're listening to 102 Hours, where stories don't just get told, they come alive in the dark. The air between us tonight is heavier than usual, thick with the promise that whatever you hear next will follow you to bed. You've got your safe spot, maybe a blanket pulled up or a chair turned toward the door. You probably won't survive this in one piece, at least. Not the part of you that believes the world is predictable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to 102 Hours, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling brave, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I want to see exactly where in the world you're listening from, and whether it's dark outside your window yet. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let 102 Hours guide you into tonight's journey. The first killer is not the monster under your bed or the shadow at the corner of your vision. He doesn't even look dangerous. He could be your neighbor, your customer, the man who smiles politely as you pass him on the street. His name is David Parker Ray, and he didn't need to lurk in the shadows. He built his own. They called it the Toy Box, but it was no place for toys. The town of truth or consequences. New Mexico sounds like the kind of quirky stop you might make on a road trip. Sun-bleached signs, quiet streets, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. But for years, hidden in a soundproof trailer parked on the edge of Elephant Butte Lake, Ray crafted a private chamber of horror. From the outside, it looked unremarkable, a simple, white cargo trailer. Step inside, and you entered a different reality. Walls lined with pulleys, chains, surgical tools, and devices whose purposes you'd rather not picture for long. Ray worked as a park ranger. He had friends, neighbors, even a girlfriend who, disturbingly, became an accomplice. His victims weren't strangers to him at first glance. Some were hitchhikers, others sex workers, women he believed the world wouldn't miss. His method was methodical in the way a craftsman approaches his art. Careful preparation, precise execution, and a chilling detachment. But what made Ray's crimes uniquely disturbing wasn't just the physical cruelty, it was the psychology. Before anything began, his victims were forced to listen to a cassette tape he'd recorded. His voice, calm and deliberate, would describe in graphic detail what was about to happen to them. Imagine sitting there, bound, hearing the man who controls your fate walk you through your own destruction as if reading from a manual. The FBI believes he may have killed more than 50 women, though no confirmed bodies were ever found. That absence of evidence is a shadow that lingers over the case. Did he have a way of disposing of them so completely that nothing remained? Or were there survivors who never came forward? Investigators still debate whether his girlfriend was just a manipulated pawn or an equal partner in cruelty. The toy box itself became a grotesque museum exhibit for the criminally curious. Photographs taken during the investigation show meticulous organization, labeled drawers, sterilized tools, and walls covered in diagrams. It's the kind of place that makes you realize the human mind can create hell without fire or brimstone, just plywood, steel, and intent. When police finally closed in on Ray in 1999, it wasn't because of years of profiling or a sudden confession. It was because one of his victims escaped, running naked through the desert, still wearing the collar and chain he'd locked around her neck. She led officers straight to the trailer, and from there, the horrors came spilling out. In court, Ray sat quietly, almost bored. He pled guilty to kidnapping and torture, but avoided a murder conviction because, without bodies, the prosecution couldn't prove the rest. He was sentenced to over 200 years in prison, but died of a heart attack in 2002, just 3 years into his sentence. Some would say justice was never served. Others believe his death was the only way his story could end. And yet, you can't shake the image of that trailer, sitting somewhere in the desert sun, its walls still holding the echoes of the cries that no one outside ever heard. You wonder if the desert could talk. Would it whisper his secrets, or would it stay silent? Out of fear. That's the thing about killers like Ray. They don't need to stalk you in the streets. They can build their own hunting ground, brick by brick, and wait for you to walk in. And once you do, there's no escape unless luck decides to intervene. You take a breath, thinking that maybe the worst part is over. But the next face waiting in this lineup of nightmares wears an even stranger mask, not of chains and desert dust, but of cultured charm and polished manners. And behind that mask is a hunger that Paris would never forget. You picture it, Paris in the early 1980s. Cafes spill warm light onto cobblestone streets, the smell of espresso hanging in the air, artists with paint-stained fingers arguing in low voices over glasses of red wine. It's a city of beauty, a city that feels like it belongs in another world entirely from the dusty horror of New Mexico. And yet, even here, evil found its stage. This time, it wore a tailored suit, spoke in gentle tones, and quoted literature over dinner. His name was Issei Sagawa, and to anyone meeting him for the first time, he seemed forgettable, soft-spoken, polite, a little shy, the kind of man you'd never suspect of carrying an appetite that could turn stomachs around the globe. Sagawa was born in Japan in 1949, into a wealthy family that ensured he received the best education money could buy. He studied abroad, first in Japan, then in France, chasing a PhD in literature at the Sorbonne. To his classmates, he was eccentric, but harmless, a man more comfortable in libraries than in nightclubs. But behind that scholarly veneer was an obsession that had been growing since childhood, one that he spoke of to no one, the desire to consume human flesh. His target was chosen not for wealth, power, or revenge, but for beauty. Renee was a Dutch classmate, vibrant and intelligent, with a kindness that seemed to include everyone around her, including They studied together, shared coffee, exchanged ideas about poetry and art. For Renee, this was friendship. For Sagawa, it was a carefully woven net. In June 1981, he invited her to his apartment for dinner, telling her they could work on translating poetry. She accepted after all. She knew him, trusted him. The apartment was small, cluttered with books and papers, the kind of place you might find any student in Paris living in. But hidden within that space was a loaded rifle. What happened next became one of the most infamous crimes in modern history. He shot her in the back of the neck while she sat at his desk, killing her instantly. Then, over the course of the next 2 days, he carried out the fantasy that had consumed his thoughts for years. He ate parts of her body, photographing each stage as though documenting a personal experiment. When he was done, He packed the remains into 2 suitcases and called a taxi, telling the driver he needed to deliver them to a lake. But Paris has a way of noticing the unusual, and the sight of a small man struggling to haul heavy, blood-seeping luggage did not go ignored. Passers-by grew suspicious. Police were called. Within hours, the contents of the suitcases were discovered, and Sagawa was arrested. If this were America, the story might have ended in a trial and a life sentence, but French law at the time declared him mentally unfit to stand trial, and he was committed to a psychiatric hospital. In a twist that still outrages many, his wealthy family arranged for his deportation back to Japan, where legal loopholes meant he could not be tried again for the same crime. After just 4 years in confinement, Issei Sagawa walked free. He didn't vanish into obscurity. Instead, he leaned into his infamy, writing books about his crime, appearing on talk shows, even reviewing restaurants. Japan's media treated him with a morbid fascination, and he seemed eager to feed it. He gave interviews in which he spoke casually about his fantasies, often smiling, a smile that somehow never reached his eyes. Sagawa lived for decades after the murder, frail in appearance but active in the public eye, until his death in 2022. He never expressed true remorse, only a kind of detached curiosity about his own nature. What makes his story so disturbing isn't just the crime itself, but the surreal contrast between the act and the man, a polite, educated figure, moving through polite, educated spaces, carrying an appetite that no law or prison could erase. It's the reminder that horror doesn't always wear the face of a monster. Sometimes it looks like someone who'd hold the door open for you. Thank you for your time. And then imagine how you might taste. And as you sit with that thought, the memory of David Parker raised desert shadows still lingering in your mind. You realize that the monsters in this lineup are getting harder to spot. The next one, in fact, could have been your neighbor, the man who smiled at you in passing, even as the smell of death seeped through his walls. That smile fades into something colder now, a sense of unease you can't quite name, like catching a whiff of something sour in an otherwise clean kitchen. The image of polite Parisian cafes dissolves, replaced by the warm California light of the late 1970s, bouncing off stucco walls and sunburned lawns. This is Sacramento, a place where doors are often left unlocked and neighbors still greet each other by name. But behind one of those doors lives Richard Chase, a man whose darkness doesn't wait for nightfall to emerge. You picture his apartment first. The blinds are always drawn, the air stale. There's an odor that creeps into the hall, metallic, rotten, and hard to ignore. Neighbors complain, but Chase shrugs it off, claiming bad plumbing. What they don't know is that inside, the refrigerator holds more than milk and eggs, and the blender has seen far worse than smoothies. Born in 1950, Chase's childhood wasn't the sort to make headlines. There were cracks, a troubled family, early signs of mental illness, but nothing that screamed what was coming. By his teens, though, the cracks widened. He developed a fascination with death, began killing animals, and displayed a growing obsession with blood. Doctors later diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, but treatment was inconsistent, and his delusions hardened into something unshakable. He became convinced that his own blood was turning to powder, that his heart was shrinking, and that the only cure was fresh blood. In December 1977, he took his first human life. Ambrose Griffin, a random man shot in a drive-by for no reason. Beyond opportunity, it was senseless, quick, and for Chase, just a prelude. Over the next month, he escalated into daylight home invasions, entering through unlocked doors as if accepting an unspoken invitation. He didn't stalk victims for days or weeks. He simply wandered until he found an opening. What happened inside was worse than any ghost story. He would kill quickly, then carry out rituals that blurred the line between murder and something far more primal. Chase drank blood, sometimes mixing it with organ tissue in a blender, convinced this would keep him alive. His victims ranged from single men to entire families, and once a pregnant woman and her 22-month-old child. The randomness was part of the terror. There was no pattern, no safety net. By January 1978, Sacramento was in panic mode. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, and the police began advising residents to keep lights on at night. Still, Chase moved freely, his gaunt frame and disheveled appearance blending into the city's edges. Witness descriptions painted a picture of someone unkempt, with wild eyes, a man you might avoid on the street, but not necessarily suspect of mass murder. His downfall came after one particularly brutal killing. Fingerprints at the scene, combined with witness reports, led police to his apartment. The moment they entered, the smell confirmed their worst fears. The walls were stained dark, the fridge and utensils coated in residue that no one wanted to identify. It was less a home than a crypt with plumbing. At trial, his defense leaned on insanity, arguing that he was too mentally ill to comprehend his actions. But the jury saw the evidence, and the verdict was death. He never reached the execution chamber in 1980. He took his own life in prison with an overdose of smuggled antidepressants. Richard Chase remains one of the most unsettling figures in American criminal history, not just for his brutality, but for the way he erased the boundary between predator and neighbor. He didn't hide in shadows. He knocked on doors in broad daylight. And sometimes, people let him in. And as you sit with that thought, the air in your own room feels a little heavier. You've already met two faces of horror, one methodical and cruel, the other polite and calculated. But the next, he doesn't wait for your guard to drop. He comes in with it still up, slipping into your life like a shadow that breathes. You don't realize how much comfort you take from the idea of a locked door until you imagine one that opens into Ed Gein's farmhouse. The image comes to you, slowly, at first, an isolated house on the edge of Plainfield, Wisconsin, November. Wind rattling the bare branches outside. It's the kind of rural quiet that seems harmless, almost wholesome, until you notice the silence feels watched. Gein lived alone here after his mother died in 1945, and if you ask the townsfolk, they'll tell you he was odd but polite, a little awkward, the kind of man you might see at the general store, cap in hand, buying kerosene or chewing tobacco, offering a shy nod. But the truth was that Gein's world stopped moving the day his mother passed. He boarded up her rooms, left them untouched, and retreated into a reality stitched together from books on anatomy, pulp horror magazines, and a mind slowly folding in on itself. For a decade, the house stood as both his shelter and his workshop. Inside, there was clutter. Yes, piles of junk, stacks of newspapers, but buried under the mess was something far darker. Gein's fascination with the human body went beyond curiosity. By 1957, whispers in Plainfield began to grow louder. And not just because people were going missing. It was the disappearance of Bernice Worden, the local hardware store owner, that finally brought the police to his door. Snow was falling that day, muffling the sound of boots crunching toward the porch. They entered expecting to find clues, maybe stolen goods, maybe a weapon. What they found instead would turn a quiet farming community into the setting of nightmares. Furniture, upholstered in human skin. A lampshade, stretched and tanned, glowing faintly under the bulb. A box of noses. A belt sewn from strips of flesh. Masks made from faces, some so carefully preserved they seemed ready to blink. In the shed, the body of Bernice hung upside down, dressed like a deer in the first stages of butchering. Investigators pieced together that Gein hadn't killed all the people whose remains were found. Many came from local graveyards. He would dig at night, working quickly under moonlight, carrying home parts he thought he could use. In his mind, these were materials, components for the project he was building. A woman's suit fashioned from real skin, so he could become his mother and, in his words, feel close to her again. There's a moment, reading his confession, that makes your stomach tighten. He speaks with no malice, no outward thrill, just a kind of rural matter-of-factness, as if describing how to repair a fence. Investigators still debate whether Gein's actions were driven purely by delusion, or if deeper compulsions ones we can't fully map were at work. The trial came in 1968, delayed by years of psychiatric evaluations. Gein was found guilty but legally insane, spending the rest of his life in a mental institution. He died in 1984, never expressing remorse, never admitting to more than what had already been uncovered. Yet his influence, if you can call it that, seeped into American culture like a stain. Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, all stitched together from pieces of Ed Gein's reality. And now, as the image of that quiet farmhouse fades in your mind, it's replaced by a thought you can't quite shake. Monsters aren't always fast-moving shadows or strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes they're men who live down the road, wave politely at church, and walk you home when the night gets too cold. You've seen polite masks, vampiric delusions, and now the skin-deep horrors of Plainfield. The line ahead only gets darker. Somewhere in Tokyo, another quiet man is waiting, one whose silence hides an obsession entirely his own. Tokyo in the late 1980s hums differently than anywhere else you've been so far. Neon signs flickering in kanji, vending machines glowing in narrow alleys, the muffled thud of subway doors closing. It's a city where anonymity is easy to come by, where millions pass each other without a glance. And somewhere in that vast crowd moves a man so quiet, so unremarkable. You could sit beside him on the train and never remember his face. Tsutomu Miyazaki didn't look like a predator. Thin, bespectacled, soft-spoken, if you saw him at a manga shop or hunched over a vending machine coffee, you'd think of him as just another shy young man. In many ways, he was exactly that. Except for the growing collection in his apartment that police would later call the Library of Horror. Born in 1962, Miyazaki entered the world with physical deformities in his hands, a birth defect that made him painfully self-conscious. He retreated into himself, rarely making friends, spending hours immersed in comic books and horror films. Over time, his fascination shifted from the fictional to the real. By his early 20s, his isolation had deepened into something far more dangerous. Between 1988 and 1989, Miyazaki abducted and murdered 4 young girls, ages between 4 and 7. His method wasn't rushed or chaotic. It was deliberate, patient. He would lure them away, often in broad daylight, to remote spots on the outskirts of Tokyo. The acts themselves are too grim to detail fully here. But what followed pushed him into a category of killers whose crimes are remembered as much for their psychology as their violence. He photographed his victims, kept personal items, and in some cases returned to the scene days later. Back in his apartment, his shelves sagged under the weight of thousands of videotapes, horror films, anime, crime documentaries, and, most disturbingly, recordings of his victims. Investigators found everything meticulously labeled, as if cataloging a private museum. The police also uncovered a series of disturbing letters Miyazaki had written to the families of his victims, taunting them with vague references and cruel reminders. What truly unsettled the public, though, was Miyazaki's demeanor after his arrest. He sat in interrogation rooms with the same blank calm he had shown in public life. Sometimes he would drift into speaking about his favorite animated characters as if they were real people. Other times, he'd described his crimes with the detachment of a man explaining the plot of a movie. Investigators still question whether he was fully aware of the gravity of his actions, or whether his inner world was so fractured that reality had become just another form of entertainment to him. His trial became a media spectacle in Japan, not just because of the brutality, but because of what it revealed about the darker corners of the otaku subculture, a term for obsessive fans of manga and anime. While most fans were harmless, Miyazaki's crimes became an unfair shadow over the entire community, sparking debates about the influence of media on the vulnerable and isolated. In 2008, after nearly 2 decades of legal proceedings, Miyazaki was executed by hanging. For many, it closed a chapter that had haunted Tokyo for years. But the fear he inspired was never just about his crimes. It was about the realization that someone so withdrawn, so apparently harmless, could carry out something so carefully cruel. Now, as you drift from the fluorescent-lit streets of Tokyo back into the dim corridors of memory, the silence he left behind feels heavier than any scream. You've walked past polite predators, men who turn skin into trophies, and killers who drink blood to survive. But this one reminds you that sometimes evil doesn't come crashing in. Sometimes it sits quietly beside you, humming along, with the train's steady rhythm, waiting for the moment you stop paying attention. Somewhere in Moscow, another man is already waiting to make his move. One who plays a game where the pieces are human lives, and the only winning move is to kill again. Moscow greets you with a sky the color of wet steel, clouds hanging low over rows of Soviet-era apartment blocks. The sidewalks glisten from a morning drizzle, and the air smells faintly of damp concrete and exhaust fumes. Somewhere in this sprawling city, a man is walking with a plastic bag in one hand. Inside, a bottle of vodka, 2 disposable cups, and the promise of conversation. But for Alexander Pichushkin, small talk is just the opening move. Born in 1974, Pichushkin seemed like any other boy on the south side of Moscow, except for a head injury at the age of 4 that left him prone to sudden bursts of aggression. As he grew older, he found comfort in the quiet logic of chess, spending hours at a battered wooden table in Bitsa Park, challenging anyone willing to play. But while most saw chess as a pastime, Pichushkin turned it into a philosophy, one where every victim was a piece on his personal board. His first known murder came in 1992, when he was just 18. The victim was a classmate, lured to a building site and pushed from a window. Pichushkin claimed it was an accident, but deep down, it was the first calculated strike in a game that would span over a decade. By the early 2000s, he had transformed Bitsa Park into his hunting ground. The wooded paths and abandoned structures offered cover, and the steady trickle of strangers ensured. No one noticed when someone didn't make it home. His approach was deceptively simple. He'd offer a drink, strike up a conversation, and suggest a walk to a quiet spot. Once there, a sudden blow to the head with a hammer or blunt object would end the game. Sometimes, he would place the empty vodka bottle in the wound, a grim signature. Victims were left in drains, under leaves, or in shallow pits, each one mentally marked on his invisible chessboard. Pichushkin once told investigators his goal was to kill 64 people, one for each square on the board. But in interviews, he admitted the number was flexible. "If I'd reached 64, I would have had to make a new board," he said, smiling as if discussing tournament strategy. Officially, he was convicted of 48 murders, but police suspect the true number was higher, possibly over 60. What makes Pichushkin's story even more unsettling is how ordinary he seemed to acquaintances. Neighbors described him as polite, sometimes even helpful, though quiet. But in his mind, killing was not a crime. It was a form of sport, a way to feel alive. "For me, life without murder is like life without food," he told the court. His downfall came in 2006, when one of his last victims, a co-worker named Marina, told friends she was meeting him in Bitsa Park. When she didn't return, suspicion fell on Pichushkin, and CCTV footage confirmed they had been together. Police searching his home found his scorecard, a folded piece of paper with a grid, each square marked with a victim's initials or a symbol. The trial riveted Russia, with the press dubbing him the chessboard killer. He sat in the courtroom calm and expressionless, occasionally offering chilling insights into his methods. When asked why he killed women as well as men, he shrugged. "Everyone is a piece. It's the position that matters, not the color." In 2007, Pichushkin was sentenced to life in prison, the first 15 years to be served in solitary confinement. To this day, he spends his hours in a tiny cell, without a chessboard, without opponents, just an empty game stretching endlessly in his mind. You leave Moscow's grey skyline behind. The image of that invisible board burned into your thoughts. The next figure you'll meet doesn't play games at all. He moves silently through hospital wards, carrying death in his veins, and his touch is as final as a checkmate. The hospital corridors smell faintly of antiseptic and overbrewed coffee, a scent that never quite leaves no matter how many times the floors are scrubbed. The fluorescent lights hum softly overhead, washing everything in a pale, clinical glow. In the corner, a nurse bends over a patient's chart, her pen scratching a slow rhythm. You watch the scene for a moment before noticing another figure in pale green scrubs, moving between rooms with quiet precision. There's nothing unusual about him at first glance, until you realize how often he's the last person to see a patient alive. Charles Cullen, born in 1960 in West Orange, New Jersey, had a life marked by tragedy long before he became one of America's most prolific serial killers. His father died when Charles was just an infant, and his mother, the only steady presence in his life, was killed in a car accident when he was still in high school. By his early 20s, Cullen had trained as a nurse, a profession built on trust and care. But in his hands, the role became something far darker. He started his career at St. Barnabas Medical Center in 1987. Within a year, patients began dying under strange circumstances. Cullen's weapon was subtle, lethal doses of medications like digoxin and insulin, drugs that in small amounts could heal, but in the wrong quantities, quietly stopped a heart. There was no blood, no violence, just a sudden and inexplicable decline that doctors chalked up to natural causes. For years, he drifted from hospital to hospital across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Each time suspicions arose, a spike in deaths, unusual lab results, missing vials, he resigned before an investigation could take root. The American healthcare system's fragmented oversight worked in his favor, and by the time he was finally caught, investigators estimated he may have killed more than 40 patients, possibly as many as 400. Cullen's motives remain a source of debate. He claimed he was ending patients' suffering, a twisted form of mercy killing. But many of his victims weren't terminally ill. Some were recovering, expected to leave the hospital within days. Prosecutors argued that Cullen's actions were about control, about deciding who lived and who died. Cloaked in the authority of a nurse's uniform, his capture in 2003 was the result of quiet, persistent work by two unlikely detectives, fellow nurse Amy Lowren and a small police team who combed through patient records, cross-referencing deaths with Cullen's shifts. The trail of numbers was damning to many sudden declines on the days he worked, to many unexplained medication withdrawals from the pharmacy logs. When confronted, Cullen spoke with an unsettling calm, answering questions without emotion. In interviews, he seemed almost detached from the enormity of what he'd done, as if recounting routine tasks rather than the theft of human lives. The press dubbed him the Angel of Death, a name that seemed both fitting and disturbingly understated. In 2006, Charles Cullen was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Today, he sits in a New Jersey prison, his name a permanent scar on the trust between patients and those meant to heal them. You leave the echoing halls of the hospital behind, but the memory of those silent, fluorescent-lit rooms lingers. The next man you'll meet is nothing like Cullen, towering, articulate, and disturbingly polite. He'll invite you into his car for a ride you'll wish you never accepted. The hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights fades, replaced by the low, steady purr of an idling engine. Outside, the night is cool and damp, the scent of wet asphalt clinging to the air. You're standing at the curb, and a tall shadow moves toward you, impossibly tall, framed by the dim glow of a street lamp. He smiles, polite and almost shy, and asks if you need a ride. His voice is calm, the kind of voice you could imagine on a radio station late at night, reading poetry. You hesitate, but his manner is so reassuring, so ordinary, that it's easy to step closer. This is Edmund Kemper, the man the press would later call the co-ed killer. Born in 1948 in Burbank, California, Kemper's childhood was a quiet disaster. His parents divorced early, and he was left in the care of an abusive mother who belittled him relentlessly. At just 15, Kemper ran away to live with his paternal grandparents, a move that ended in tragedy when he killed them both. Sent to a psychiatric facility, he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, though doctors later decided he was merely highly intelligent and deeply troubled. By the age of 21, he was released back into the world, his criminal record sealed, standing at 6 feet 9 inches and weighing over 250 pounds. Kemper was physically imposing, but his demeanor disarmed the people he spoke with intelligence and humor, loved books, and had a fascination with police work. He often drank with local officers, earning the nickname Big Ed. No one suspected that between 1972 and 1973, he was killing young women he picked up while they were hitchhiking. Kemper's methods were chilling in their efficiency. He'd drive his victims to remote areas where escape was impossible. What made him even more disturbing was his ability to converse easily with them moments before committing his crimes, as if nothing about what was to come was unusual to him. Afterward, he would often return to his mother's home, hiding his crimes in plain sight. In April 1973, after killing his mother and her best friend, Kemper reached what he later described as his breaking point. He drove nearly 1,000 miles to Pueblo, Colorado, and called the police from a payphone, confessing to everything. The officers, many of whom knew him personally, were stunned. The man they'd shared beers with was confessing to 8 murders. During his trial, Kemper's testimony was eerily calm and self-aware. He spoke about his actions with chilling clarity, offering insights into his own compulsions and the resentment he held toward his mother. To this day, criminologists study his case for its combination of extreme violence, high intelligence, and apparent self-reflection. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and now spends his days at California Medical Facility. In recorded interviews, his deep, deliberate voice still has the same unsettling politeness, the kind that makes you lean in before you realize you're listening to a killer. You leave the image of the towering man behind, but his presence lingers. A reminder that monsters don't always roar. Sometimes they ask how your day's been before they decide it's your last. Ahead, there's a man with a taste for fine suits, polished manners, and an acid bath strong enough to erase every trace of you. The smell hits you first, sharp, chemical, and oddly metallic. It clings to the back of your throat as you follow the echo of footsteps down a narrow corridor. The floor is slick, your shoes squeaking faintly, and at the far end, a door stands, ajar. Beyond it, the faint clink of glass, as if someone is gently swirling ice in a tumbler dot. Inside, a man in a well-tailored suit greets you with a warm smile. His hair is neatly combed, his tie perfectly knotted, and his hands are spotless. Far too spotless for someone who spends his days surrounded by acid vats. This is George Haigh, the man history would dub the acid bath murderer. To him, charm was as much a tool as the steel drums lining the corner of the room. Born in 1909 in Stamford, England, Hay's upbringing was strict and insular. His parents devout members of the Plymouth Brethren religious sect. He grew up sheltered from much of the outside world, taught to see sin lurking in every shadow. As a young man, he worked various jobs, mechanic, salesman, even chauffeur, but trouble seemed to follow him. A stint in prison for fraud gave him the idea that would later define his crimes. Without a body, the law could not prove murder. By the mid-1940s, Hay's schemes had grown more ambitious. He targeted wealthy acquaintances, luring them with promises of lucrative investments or business ventures. Once he had them alone, often in his workshop, he would kill them with a gun or blunt instrument, then submerge their bodies in concentrated sulfuric acid. Over the course of a day or two, the acid reduced flesh and bone to sludge, which he would pour down a drain or into the garden. Haigh didn't just kill for profit. He lived extravagantly on his victims' wealth. Fine restaurants, luxury hotels, expensive suits. He relished the life of a gentleman. It was a mask that fit him well, allowing him to move easily among London's upper class without raising suspicion. His victims simply disappeared, and with no bodies left behind. Police had little to go on, but arrogance proved to be his undoing. In 1949, the disappearance of a wealthy widow named Olive Duran Dickon drew police attention. Hay's story unraveled quickly under scrutiny, and a search of his workshop revealed damning evidence: a gallstone, a denture plate, and traces of human fat that had resisted the acid. Forensic scientists used these remnants to prove murder, making his no body, no crime belief tragically flawed at his trial. Haigh shocked the courtroom by claiming he had drunk his victim's blood, though this was likely a ploy to bolster an insanity defense. The jury was unconvinced. Within minutes, they found him guilty of 6 murders, though he had hinted at many more. On August 10, 1949, George Haigh was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison. In the end, his meticulous manners and polished charm couldn't mask the cold calculation beneath. He left behind a legacy that still chills: the image of a man in an impeccable suit, leaning casually against a vat of acid, discussing investment opportunities over tea. You step away from the smell, though it seems to cling to your clothes, and the echo of polite conversation follows you down the hall. But the detail that threads these rooms together isn't the method or the setting. It's the same practiced kindness. A tea poured with a smile, a soft invitation, the courteous offer that folds the world in on itself. Follow that small courtesy across oceans and climates. It will lead you now into heat and dust, into the neat folder and the practiced handshake that becomes a path to ruin. You leave the chemical tang of London's workshop behind and step into heat, thick, breath-holding heat that smells of dust and diesel. Johannesburg's skyline shimmers ahead, and the road pulls you east through townships where tin roofs glint and afternoon clouds stack like anvils. Somewhere between Atteridgeville, Boksburg, and Cleveland, a man has learned how to turn hope into a lure and a promise into a trap. Moses Sithole doesn't announce himself. He dresses neatly, carries a folder under his arm, and speaks in a soft, orderly tone that makes you want to listen. The pitch is always simple. A children's charity is hiring. There's training, there's a stipend. There's a real chance to get on your feet. He prefers public places for the first meeting: a bus stop, a taxi rank, a street market where radios mutter and vendors call out over crates of mangoes. The second meeting, though, is quieter. That's where the path bends away from the crowd. Between 1994 and 1995, bodies begin to surface. In grass fields, in scrub lots not far from footpaths, sometimes near construction debris where the city's growth leaves ragged edges. The 3 letters that stick A, B, C belong to the townships where victims are found: Atteridgeville, Boksburg, Cleveland. Newspapers print the initials, and the name takes on a rhythm: the ABC Killer, as if a mnemonic could make sense of the senseless. Police are stretched thin, the country itself shifting under the weight of transition. New laws, new leadership, new expectations, and still the oldest questions in criminology remain. Who is doing this, and how do we stop him? By the mid-1990s, behavioral profiling has spread from the FBI's playbook into police units around the world. Detectives begin to map patterns, victimology, approach, and dump sites, hoping the geometry of the crimes will sketch a face. The approach is consistent enough to be recognizable. He introduces himself as a recruiter. He schedules a walk to the office just past that line of trees, near that low building. He keeps the tone friendly, the pace unthreatening, never hurrying, never raising a voice. Control, here, is quiet. Victims are taken to out-of-the-way places where traffic noise thins and tall grass hisses in the wind. They're bound with clothing, strangled, left where chance or a passerby will eventually find them. What spreads fastest is the fear. Job seekers begin comparing notes on the taxi rides. Mothers keep daughters home. Men linger at corners, scanning faces for a neatly dressed stranger with a convincing smile. Churches hold night meetings. Hardware stores do brisk trade in padlocks and whistles. You move through these streets and feel something communal and electric. The way a city learns its speed, rumor turning to warning, warning hardening into rules. Don't go alone, don't follow, don't believe a job that starts with a walk. Detectives, work angles, missing person reports, last seen testimonies, morgue photographs, lists of charity offices that aren't real. A pattern sharpens, a polite man with paperwork, a short interview in public, then a path that leaves the road. Investigators still question whether the final tally tells the whole story. Because, in fast-changing days with uneven record-keeping, any count is a shadow of a truth no one wants to face. When the net finally tightens in late 1995, it's a mess of luck and legwork. A survivor's description, cross-checked with prior charges. The realization that the man they're hunting has already been inside the system and walked back out. The chase through crowded streets, the sudden flash of a blade in a narrow passage. Officers yelling, people scattering, then gunshots and a body on the ground that is not dead yet. You stand at the edge of the crowd as uniforms close in. Someone says the name softly, as if it might change the facts. It doesn't. In interrogation rooms, Sithole is composed, almost fastidious. He answers questions plainly, sometimes smiling, as if the grammar of guilt and innocence is an academic exercise. He admits to murders. He describes the charity ruse with a salesman's clarity. The details are clinical, and that is somehow worse. No ranting, no theatrics, just a man explaining the steps he took, as though he's teaching you how to assemble a machine. The trial in 1997 pulls crowds the way thunderstorms pull air. Families sit on benches with folded hands, eyes fixed, on a dock that refuses to become a cautionary tale because caution didn't fail them, a human being did. The judge reads counts, murder, rape, robbery, and the numbers climb until they can't be held in a single breath. The sentence lands like a wall, more than 2,400 years, stacked so that even the arithmetic feels like a moral statement. No parole, not in this life. A quirky detail lingers in the public mind. Those 3 letters, ABC, so tidy, so schoolbook, simple, affixed to a series of crimes that taught an entire city not to trust introductions. The nickname makes the story easy to tell and hard to forget, a template stamped onto grief that never needed branding. You walk the margins of one of those fields at dusk. Cicadas drone. A commuter train clicks over a distant bridge. The grass shows the faint, flattened trace of a path that fades and then reappears, as if memory itself can't decide what to keep. A plastic bag flutters from a thorn bush, white against the creeping dark, and you think of how many crimes hinge on ordinary objects. A folder, a pen, a promise of work. History will shelve Sithole beside other planners, men who tailored an approach, refined it, and ran it like a franchise. But he also belongs to the larger, colder category that this night has been mapping for you. Killers who weaponize trust. Whether it's a ride in a car, a glass poured with a steady hand, a walk to an office, the entry point is always something normal, something you've done 100 times and will do 100 times again. You listen to the wind coming off the high veld and feel the story shift under your feet. 10 killers now stand behind you like mile markers. The roots between them, the shared tactics, the ways institutions failed, the pressure points of poverty, charisma, medicine, and myth start to braid into one chord. When you turn back toward the city lights, it's not to leave this behind, but to lay the pieces side by side and see what they mean together. You've walked through the shadows of 10 different lives, 10 distorted worlds where violence was currency and trust was just another weapon. Yet now, standing here, you start to see something you couldn't when you were trapped in each killer's orbit. The threads, they're faint, like fishing line strung between darkened lampposts. But once you notice them, you can't unsee them. Each of those faces, David Parker, Ray's cold calculation, Issei Sagawa's polite hunger, Richard Chase's unhinged chaos, Ed Gein's lonely madness, Tsutomu Miyazaki's retreat into fantasy, Alexander Pichushkin's obsessive game, Charles Cullen's clinical quiet, Edmund Kemper's deceptive gentleness, George Haigh's smooth deceit. All of them operated in different landscapes, with different tools, different masks, and yet their shadows overlap. You remember how some of them planned meticulously, mapping out every step like an architect of destruction. Ray and Pichushkin, for example, one treating suffering as art, the other playing chess with lives. Both saw human beings as objects to be moved, shaped, removed from the board. Others, like Chase or Miyazaki, moved like storms, unpredictable and devastating, striking without warning. Methodical or chaotic, they all shared one truth. Control was never about the act alone. It was about the feeling they drew from it. And you realize that feeling wasn't always rage. Sometimes it was curiosity, as with Sagawa, a man whose violence was dressed up in the language of culture and refinement. Sometimes it was a twisted form of intimacy, as Cullen's bedside murders suggested. Sometimes, as with Gein, it was an attempt to bridge the yawning gap of loneliness. No matter how grotesque the bridge became, you think back to how icily each of them navigated their worlds, how invisible they could be until they chose not to. Be a soft-spoken nurse, a bookish translator, a quiet neighbor who nodded hello in the hallway. They didn't just hide in plain sight, they thrived there. Because they knew, better than most, that the human brain craves patterns. And when someone doesn't fit the pattern of danger, they're given access without question. That's the second thread. Manipulation of trust. Every single one of them found a way to make their prey step closer instead of running away. Ray with promises of fun, Haigh with business deals, Kemper with his calm, almost fatherly voice. Even Chase, despite his disheveled appearance, relied on the simple fact that many people didn't lock their doors. They didn't need to break down defenses when they could walk right through them. But there's a darker third thread, one that twists deeper into your mind the longer you think about it, the way they bent reality around themselves. Each killer built a world where they were the center, the arbiter of who lived and who didn't. In that personal universe, morals bent like candle wax. Sagawa could dine on his victim and call it love. Pichushkin could measure worth by whether someone fit his chessboard. Gein could stitch together trophies and call them companions. In their eyes, these weren't just crimes. They were acts that reinforced their own sense of purpose. And then there's the final thread, the one that feels like it's brushing against your own skin now, the echo they leave behind. For their victims' families, that echo is unbearable. But for society, it's a reminder that monsters don't all come from dark alleys in strange cities. They can be in a hospital corridor, in a bookstore, or sitting beside you on a long bus ride. You start to piece together the truth. The differences between them are cosmetic: the country, the method, the pace. But the similarities are structural, like the bones beneath the skin. Each one exploited human trust. Each one justified their acts in a personal logic that defied outside morality. Each one left behind not just victims, but stories that still walk in the dark long after their bodies are gone. And now, as you stand at this point in the journey, the threads seem to pull tighter, knotting themselves into something heavier. You can almost feel the weight of it, not just 10 separate nightmares, but one sprawling tapestry of human cruelty. A tapestry you've been staring at for so long now that you can't tell if the patterns are forming in the fabric or in your own mind. For a moment, you wonder if that was the point all along, to make you see the shape of darkness, not as a series of isolated events, but as something woven through history, through culture, through the quiet spaces of everyday life. And if that's true, then maybe the next person you pass in the street isn't just a stranger. Maybe they're a thread too. You've traced the threads between 10 killers, felt them knot and twist into a single, heavy truth. But to understand why they did what they did, to step deeper into that place where morality collapses and instinct takes over, you have to go further. You have to walk into the predator's mind. It isn't like opening a door. It's like stepping into a hallway with no clear walls, where the air feels close and every sound is dampened. At first, it's quiet, almost calm. This is where most people make their first mistake, thinking that killers are always boiling over with rage or snarling with hate. In reality, many of them feel nothing at all. Emotions are muted, like colors in an old photograph. You think of Charles Cullen, moving between hospital beds with the steady, unhurried pace of a man delivering a routine service, or George Haigh pouring acid into a barrel while humming under his breath, his mind already on the money he'd claim after the body was gone. The calm isn't a mask. It's the natural state inside this mental landscape. Then, the first shapes start to emerge in the dark memories, obsessions, tiny slivers of thought that loop endlessly. For Richard Chase, it was the gnawing terror that his blood was drying up. For Alexander Pichushkin, it was the thrill of adding another piece to his chessboard. For Edmund Kemper, it was the desire for complete control over a world that had humiliated him when he was young. Each fixation becomes a compass, pointing always toward the next act, the next victim, the next step toward feeding the hunger. And hunger is the right word. Inside the predator's mind, everything is reduced to appetite for power, for intimacy, for revenge, for some imagined form of completion. These aren't wants. They're needs that feel as essential as air. And when the rest of the world doesn't provide it, the predator reshapes the world to get it. You notice something else here. Morality doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes, grain by grain. One boundary crossed makes the next easier. A lie told becomes the foundation for a larger deception. A fantasy indulged grows into a rehearsal for reality. Ed Gein didn't start with human skin masks. He began with graves, with collecting, with testing how far he could go before the fear faded and the excitement took over. But once the erosion is complete, something startling happens. The predator no longer sees their acts as wrong. In this space, wrong is a word other people use. Here, there is only necessary and unnecessary. Necessary is whatever feeds the hunger. Unnecessary is everything else. You walk further into the mind and realize there's a structure to it, a strange, inverted architecture. At the top is the justification, the story they tell themselves and others. For Sagawa, it was the idea. of consuming beauty to keep it forever. For Ray, it was the illusion of control over a game he believed was his to direct. Beneath that is the ritual, the pattern or method that makes each crime feel orderly, even when it's chaos to everyone else. And at the very bottom, in the deepest part of the foundation, is the impulse. Raw, unshaped, unending. Here, time doesn't work like it does outside. A killer can relive a moment from years ago as vividly as if it happened this morning. Not out of guilt, but because it fuels the same sensation they're chasing now. The past is a well they return to again and again. And now you start to see the danger. This mental space doesn't look alien from the inside. It feels reasonable to the one who lives here, which means if you stay too long, if you start to understand it too well, a part of you might start thinking it's reasonable too. You step back, out of the hallway, out of the echoes, back into your own mind. But something about the quiet that follows feels different. You've seen the shape of the predator's world. You know how it bends. And the thought that unsettles you most is that you've only been looking at the ones who were caught. Because somewhere, right now, there are minds like this still moving in the world, and they haven't been found yet. You've seen how they think, how their minds turn crime into necessity. But even the most convincing predators can't hold the mask forever. There's always a moment, a split second when the illusion falters, and the real face looks back at the world. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's so sudden that the people around them feel like they've stepped into another reality. For some, the slip comes in private. A small mistake. A word spoken too harshly. The quick flash of violence when they think no one's watching. David Parker Ray once let his control waver, letting his temper spike in front of someone he meant to manipulate. And in that instant, his careful image of calm authority cracked. For others, the mask shatters in public under the strain of pressure. Issei Sagawa's genteel Parisian facade dissolved when the police caught him mid-crime, blood and fear breaking through his polished manners. Richard Chase never wore his mask well to begin with. Neighbors would later recall erratic outbursts, staring eyes, and that unsettling stench drifting from his apartment. It's rarely a single mistake that ends them. It's a chain reaction. A neighbor who notices something odd. A witness who remembers a face. A victim who escapes. For Charles Cullen, it was a trail of hospital records and unexplained deaths that no amount of polite smiles could erase. For Pedro Rodrigues, Filho, it was the accumulation of bodies and the reputation that followed him even into prison. But the most dangerous slip is the one they don't notice themselves. Edmund Kemper's measured voice hid a restless arrogance, the belief that he was smarter than everyone around him. That arrogance made him talk too much, give too many details, and eventually it made him walk right into a police station to confess, because he believed no one else could truly understand him. When the mask slips, the predator loses more than just their cover. They lose control of the story. Suddenly, they're no longer the one shaping the narrative. The police, the press, and the public take over. Their private world is dragged into the light, dissected, and catalogued in evidence bags and court transcripts. And yet, there's something chilling about these moments. Even stripped of the mask, some killers refuse to admit defeat. George Haigh, in his last days, still joked about his crimes. Ahmad Siraji clung to his supernatural justification. Moses Sithole stood in court and smiled as if the murders were a matter of casual conversation. It's in these moments that you realize the mask wasn't just for the world, it was for themselves. When it falls away, what you see isn't a confession or an apology. It's a naked, unfiltered truth. They never really thought they were like the rest of us, and they never will. By now, you've walked with them through alleys and hospital wards, sat in the quiet of farmhouses and the chaos of police raids. You've seen the charm, the planning, the cruelty, and you've watched the moments when they're carefully built. Facades split wide open. There's no going back from here. The point of no return isn't just for them, it's for you, too. Somewhere along this journey, the curiosity that brought you here has shifted. You've stopped asking why they did it and started noticing how it changed the world around them. The landscape of fear they left behind has a shape now, and it's sharper than you expected. For each of the 10 killers, there came a moment when the tide could no longer be turned. For David Parker Ray, it was the discovery of his trailer, the walls lined with tools no one should ever need. For Issei Sagawa, it was the flashbulb pop of a police camera in Paris, the contents of his suitcase forever freezing him in the public imagination. Richard Chase's point came when his apartment door swung open to reveal what could never be unseen. Ed Gein's farmhouse, dim, cold, and filled with artifacts of horror, was the end of the line for him and for any hope that he might be dismissed as just a quiet neighbor. Tsutomu Miyazaki crossed it when his own macabre photographs became evidence. Alexander Pichushkin reached it not in a crime scene, but when police realized the scale of his self-imposed chess game. For Charles Cullen, the point came when hospitals finally connected the dots and whispers turned into formal accusations. Edmund Kemper stepped over it the day he walked into a police station and told them everything, unprompted. For Pedro Rodrigues Filho, it was the public spectacle of his prison murders, captured in testimony after testimony. Ahmad Siraji reached it when the first shallow grave gave way to dozens more, and the sugarcane fields could no longer hide their dead. The point of no return is a moment where choice vanishes. Whatever comes after trial, prison, execution is no longer theirs to steer. They might rage, they might joke, they might smile, but the direction of the story is out of their hands. And yet, here you are, staring at that invisible line from the other side. Once you've seen it, once you've stood this close to the truths people prefer to keep buried, you can't go back either. You carry the details now, the smells, the sounds, the faces, whether you want to or not. You've been walking beside them in the dark, and now, with only one door left to open, you have to ask yourself, when you step through, will you be leaving them behind or taking them with you? The hallway narrows, the air pressing closer with each step you take. 10 doors behind you, each one holding the shadow of a killer who once breathed, walked, and chose to cross lines you never thought possible. The floor beneath you creaks like it's warning you this is the last one. After this, there's no deeper to go. You push it open, expecting darkness, but instead, the room is washed in a pale, unnatural light. It's empty, yet somehow crowded. You feel them here, not in flesh and blood, but in fragments. A silver key dangling from a nail in the wall, a broken Polaroid camera on the floor, a hospital ID badge, a child's shoe, a cracked teacup. Each object whispers a story you've already walked through, proof that even when the bodies are gone, the echoes remain. This isn't the place where the killers live, it's where you do now, at least in part. The things you've seen aren't just stories anymore, they've been grafted onto you. You remember the sound of a lock clicking shut, the rustle of sugarcane in the night, the sharp scent of bleach, the hollow quiet of a room where something irreversible just happened. Some people think fear fades with distance, but you know better. Fear settles in, changes shape, and waits. It waits in a voice on the radio describing an unsolved disappearance. It waits in the corner of your eye when you pass an alley at night. It waits in your own house, in the way you double-check the locks and glance at the shadows by your window. The last door doesn't slam, it eases shut with a soft click. The sound is almost polite, but it carries weight. Outside, the air feels different. Not lighter, not heavier, just altered. Like the oxygen itself remembers where you've been. And as you step away, you notice you're walking slower. Maybe you're listening for footsteps behind you. Maybe you're just not ready to leave this place entirely. Because the truth is, the journey doesn't end when the door closes. It ends when the memories stop knocking. And some doors never stop knocking.